Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching India's World. I'm Vishal, Dahiya, and this week we're going to talk about the India-Russia bilateral relationship. Now, as all of us know, both countries share a very specific, peculiar bond, trust-based relationship partnership, which has been there for quite a long time. Now, recently, Indian Foreign Secretary Harsh Shringla made a visit to Russian capital Moscow and met several people, including the Deputy Foreign Minister and academicians, as well as people from the strategic think tanks in Russia. We'll try and analyze the state of bilateral relations between India and Russia as of now, the factors which affect this particular relationship, and the way forward, the efforts to be made from both sides. And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with Mr. Sibal. He's former Foreign Secretary. We also have Pramit Chaudhuri, Foreign Affairs Editor at Hindustan Times, and Professor Harsh Pant is also joining us, Head of the Strategic Studies Program at ORF. Welcome, all of you gentlemen, to Rajya Sabha TV. Let me begin with you, Mr. Sibal, and let's try and put these things in perspective here for our viewers, not only the historic perspective of the relations between these two nations, but also the importance or the significance of the recent visit of the Foreign Secretary.
Well, I think the recent visit of the Foreign Secretary was overdue, very timely, because we didn't have the annual summit this time between the two leaders. So that was a bit of a gap, although Prime Minister Modi has spoken to President Putin 4 times, I believe, already. But, when there are proper Foreign Office consultations, you can go over a whole gamut of issues which you don't necessarily do at the highest level, where you only focus on the very, very critical issues and problem-solving issues. Number two, there is a perception that some gaps have developed between India and Russia. Earlier on, geopolitically, there were virtually no differences between the two countries. Now, some differences are emerging. Russia, for example, has reservations about the Indo-Pacific and Quad. They are very actively supportive of the dialogue with the Taliban. So there is a bit of a gap there in terms of our joint concerns and fight against terrorism. Their relationship with China has become very strong strategically, economically, and this has upset, to my mind, the internal balance within the RIC dialogue, BRICS, as well as SCO. Now, therefore, we need to get some understanding with Russia on the basics of our ties, which are very important for the balance of our foreign policy. It will be a huge mistake on our part if, as a result of pulls and pressures that we are currently feeling, we distance ourselves from Russia. Because, as you said earlier on, it's a time-tested relationship based on trust. And in the past, Russia has been supportive of us in times of crisis and at critical moments when we needed support. Not that lately they have given us full support on some of these issues, but they have never opposed us. Therefore, they have a perception that we are going too far towards the United States, and therefore they are losing out in terms of the past strength of their relationship. Even in the defense area, they see that we are now advancing very rapidly with the United States and Israel and even France, and perhaps they feel at the cost of the privileged ties that they have. But this is a mistaken impression they have in my reading, because the dynamics of our improved ties with the United States have nothing to do with the deterioration of Russian ties with the United States. They are totally independent. And number two, and I'll stop here because one can go on, which is that we must have a foot in the door in the Russia-China relationship. If they feel that we are distancing ourselves, they will not be there to actually play some kind of a buffer between us and China. Okay. This way, since they have an interest in keeping us in BRICS and SCO and everything else, they must feel that we value that relationship. So in that light, I think Harsh Shringla's visit, as I said, was timely and has taken place at a moment when some differences are emerging, and those have to be bridged.
Okay. That's quite an apt sum up there, Mr. Sibal. Thank you so much. Let me also bring in Professor Harsh Pant here. Professor Pant, from your viewpoint, if you're looking at the state of bilateral relation between India and Russia and the factors affecting it, some of them not so as it might look like on the outside, as Mr. Sibal was pointing out, but some are really, really critical and important.
Thank you, Vishal. Some amount of shift in India's foreign policy and in the larger geopolitics, I think, is a natural consequence of what is happening around India, what is happening in the wider international system, and so there is bound to be some pulls and pressures on a relationship which historically, as Ambassador Sibal was pointing out, has been quite steady. Now, the challenge, I think, in the recent years has been that how do you make this relationship relevant for 21st century, for contemporary realities, where both Russia and China have their own interests, and they are all, and they have moved in different directions. Now, India today, if you look at Indian foreign policy, especially in the context of what has happened last year, it is bound to revolve around the China question. For Russia, the relationship is still, for large part of its foreign policy, is still predicated on the Western, anti-Western prism through which it is assessing its foreign policy priorities. So I think there is that divergence that has emerged in this context has also made it important for us to have a honest discussion with them and deliberation with them, because clearly I think no serious observer of Indian foreign policy would suggest that India and Russia go their separate ways. So there is a need for the two countries to make a concerted effort. And we had seen some progress in that direction. Prime Minister's visit, for example, last year, 2018 and 2019, Sochi summit, and then you had the Vladivostok initiative. All of those were very important markers in recent efforts of India to make this relationship more contemporary. Because the challenge is that as our geostrategic interests diverge, what are the factors that bind us? And defense in particular, you cannot have a relationship that is solely dependent on defense. And I think that's the reason why we had seen some efforts being made to diversify the relationship to other sectors and to make it more relevant to contemporary context. There has been some success, but I think as the China question becomes more and more potent in Indian foreign policy calculus, the India-Russia relationship has been looked at through a different prism. And I think what the Foreign Secretary has done in particular was to engage various stakeholders in Russia on the India question, which is, I think, very important. Russia seems to be now engaged in a very different set of conversations where India is, not at the center, where India is on the periphery. So what he seems to have done, meeting with academics, think tankers, thinkers, intellectuals, as well as with the policy establishment, is to make a concerted effort in making a case for a long-term trajectory of Indo-Russian relationship, which I think, again, remains very relevant for Indian interests and also remains very relevant for Russian interests, because I think both of us want a multipolar Indo-Pacific. They may not like the term, but multipolar Asia. And in that context, Russia would also like to see a more robust Indian presence, and India would like to see a more robust Russian presence in parts of the Indo-Pacific. So I think that is what the attempt was made, and that is perhaps the right direction in which it should go.
Okay. Pramit, your views on those geopolitical factors which we're talking about here, having effect on the India-Russia relationship, specifically the China and the US factor?
Well, the China relationship is by far the biggest difference, if you wish, between the Indo-Russian relationship today. Russia has and remains very close to the Chinese. In fact, anything because of Western sanctions has become even more close. You had Vladimir Putin publicly say that he could foresee a future in which Russia and China, for example, had a formal military alliance. And the language with Russia, as others have mentioned, their skepticism about the Indo-Pacific is predicated to some degree on the fact that for them, and this is quite logical if you're sitting in Moscow, they don't want or not support a geopolitical structure that is implicitly designed to contain or contain Chinese power. So therefore, it's not as if there's, as the Ambassador Sibal and others have mentioned, there is no problem, there is no hostility between India and Russia. To some degree, the forces of history, if you wish, are slowly pushing the relationship to a lower equilibrium. I wouldn't actually say we're moving apart, but it's a new set of relationships that or new set of forces driving that relationship. Unfortunately, China, which used to be a source of unity between the Soviet Union and us, is no longer a source of difference between India and Russia. The United States, that part of that relationship is driven, in fact, by the fact that India and China, our relationship there is now deteriorating quite rapidly. And therefore, America has to become the predominant, if you wish, strategic player in our foreign policy. That's also an inevitable result of what's happening with China. I think what we have to keep in mind that Foreign Secretary Shringla, as he mentioned, that on certain issues we can work to try and bridge the differences. And I think, as you mentioned, on Afghanistan, we have now been able to close some of that gap, which is useful. The other thing is that while the defense relationship will continue to gradually decline, not so much as because we're necessarily looking to the Americans more, but also the fact is that Russian defense technology and material is less aligned with what we need. So, for example, the type of net-centric warfare, the drones that we are looking at, kind of weapons we need against China, Russia simply is not a leader in those areas. It remains a leader in other areas. The S-400 is a perfect example. But in a lot of other areas, it's simply not a player anymore. And therefore, again, we have to look somewhere else. But I should remember one thing. Our energy relationship with Russia is becoming much, much stronger. We are now a major investor in Russian oil and gas fields. We have stepped in where the West has walked out a number of cases. And Russia is increasingly important, if you wish, to our strategic energy situation. And that's a good, should we say, partial compensation for the slow decline on the defense side.
Okay, that also is very, very interesting aspect out there. But let me bring in Mr. Sibal here again. Mr. Sibal, as both Professor Pant and Pramit is pointing out, if you're looking at the long-term trajectory of the relations between India and Russia, then the core areas, the core sectors, and obviously defense cooperation in defense sector is a long-standing one between both the nations. But apart from that, which are the areas which you believe are the go-to areas? Energy is one, as Pramit was pointing out. Perhaps the trade basket, we can, take a relook at it and maybe find out a few more solutions there.
Well, clearly defense will remain a critical component of our relationship with Russia, even as we expand our defense ties with other countries. The S-400, for example, once it is delivered, would tie us together for another 3-4 decades. Plus, all the other Russian inventory, requires upgrade, and additional orders are placed. And these are sort of long-term. This is long-term cooperation. And even if, as I said, in the natural course of meeting our defense needs, we need to go elsewhere, the Russian element in our defense panoply will remain very weighty. And it will take 30, 40 years for it to be brought down significantly in terms of percentage of the equipment of Russian origin we have with us. That is one. The other is, as rightly said, that energy has huge potential. We have already invested $14-15 billion in the Russian energy sector. And I heard our Minister Pradhan say a few months ago that, in fact, in terms of future investments of ONGC and OVL and all that, Russia is on top of the list. And the Russians also, in turn, have invested. Rosneft, for example, has invested about $12.7 billion in taking over SR and all that. There is a long-term LNG contract, and there are discussions going on to see if this can be expanded, and the Vladivostok-Chennai route can be used for these kind of supplies. Interesting, there has been a trilateral India-Russia-Japan dialogue on the energy side, because our first energy project, Sakhalin-1, involved Japan and, of course, the United States at that time. I don't know how quickly this can mature or what the exact potential is given the difference in Russia and Japan over territorial issues. Yet there is some potential there. Nuclear, you haven't mentioned nuclear. The only country that is actually setting up nuclear power plants in India is Russia. And I understand that for the next lot of power plants at Kudankulam, very advanced discussions have taken place. In some cases, some agreements have also taken place. So that is a very, very major area. And finally, in terms of space, as you know, that they have been training up people in this Gaganyaan mission for launching humans into space, so that they are very powerful actors in the space area. Even today, despite all the nastiness in the US-Russia relationship, the space cooperation carries on. So space is another area. Plus, of course, there are diamonds and this and that, pharmaceutical. These are areas we have been discussing even in my time when I was ambassador there. But we haven't achieved the kind of breakthroughs we wanted. Now, one last point in terms of energy. Look, if we were contiguous with Russia, that would have been a great boon to us. China has profited immensely because of contiguity, but unfortunately we don't have contiguity. And we can create some kind of not contiguity, but ease of communication, connectivity through the North-South corridor, through Iran. And of course, giving more beef to this Vladivostok-Chennai corridor. But let's see if this can happen.
Okay. Professor Pant, your views there on these, these aspects, specifically if we're looking at the energy sector, oil, gas, nuclear energy, and obviously defense will be one of the pillars, but then we have to look for other alternatives as well. Energy sector seems to be the one.
Yes, and I think energy will perhaps is one area which the two sides have agreed should be part of the next stage of the evolution in this relationship. If you recall Prime Minister's visit and to the Eurasian Summit, there he made this point very, very categorically that if you're looking at the next level of India-Russia relationship, energy has to be at the heart of it, because that's clearly that will change some of the issues that bedevil the relationship today about it being lackluster, that there is it's largely unidimensional, etc. So I think there is an effort being made to resurrect parts of the relationship, and to make it more contemporary. So clearly, both sides agree on that, and both sides are working on it. One aspect which I think will be important, as was pointed out earlier, will be connectivity. Now, if you are looking at connectivity issues, primarily through the prism of China, then one tends to get bogged down into all sorts of discussions as to how far China has gone and the rest of it. But I think connectivity with Russia and how our projects, some of these projects have been lagging behind because of the connectivity issues, perhaps present another opportunity for Russia and India to work together on making the sort of larger Eurasian context much more relevant to our contemporary needs. And that's something again that has been on the drawing boards for some time, and perhaps a recent push is there now, is being made now to look at it more comprehensively. Of course, you also have the Arctic issue where cooperation will eventually emerge, and there has been, again, Ambassador Shringla pointed it out during his visit this time. So what perhaps we are looking at is a reconfiguration of the relationship where energy becomes a central focal point. We'll have to see how that evolves. Given that we have had a few, we have had moved in this direction in fits and starts in the past, but clearly the momentum seems to be building up, and both sides agree on this, which is, I think, a good starting point.
Okay, and space technology also, that's also one very important aspect when you're looking at India-Russia relations.
Absolutely, and I think that has been a historical aspect to that relationship, where space has been part of this of a very robust engagement between the two sides. If I may also point out, recently vaccine, the fact that Sputnik 5 will be manufactured in India, I think also present an opportunity now to develop, as India moves to the center of the global supply chains and pharmaceuticals. Perhaps India-Russia relationship also can benefit from this.
Okay. Pramit, your views there on these aspects? You pointed out energy earlier, but if you're looking at the long-term trajectory, then how do you see things moving ahead on all these aspects, and perhaps maybe some more new areas which can be figured out in the years to come, or if we take a relook at the trade basket of both the nations?
Well, I think the concern, I think, if I'm sitting in Moscow looking at the India relationship, is the fact that too much of the relationship is effectively G to G. In other words, it's government to government, state-owned companies dealing with other state-owned companies. Too much of it is Delhi and Moscow dealing with each other. There is not enough private sector movement between the two countries. And this is going to be important. The government's present push on privatization, its overall argument correctly that the future of the Indian economy must lie with India Inc. and not with government. This is a problem because at present we simply don't have those type of links, either between the Indian private sector and government-owned companies in Russia, or between private sector companies on either side. That needs to be expanded dramatically, preferably in the next 10 years. Otherwise, the Russian economic relationship will start to dwindle or shrink in comparison, at least, to what we're doing with other countries. One of the areas, for example, people don't realize, Russia has a very robust digital economy, which is independent of the West. It has its own e-commerce firms. It has its own telecom infra, so on like that. It has its own Amazons and Facebooks and so on. These companies are technically quite sound. And given that we are open to allowing digital hubs from every country except China to set up in India, it kind of would be, one would look at that and think that perhaps some Russian firms would be prepared to consider making a play in that field that would allow us to join at one of those strongest points of our economy, which is the digital software side. Okay. And the other area I think of is that while we're looking at the oil and gas area, the other area we should be looking at is strategic minerals, the so-called rare earths, but the lithium, the cobalt, the vanadium, these are the elements of the future. These are going to be where solar power, renewable energy are going to be built around. India has only limited amounts of them, has difficulty mining them, even of what we have. Russia is, of course, a giant mineral production area. This is another area we need to be looking at because ultimately oil has a limited future as far as our economy is concerned, or we want to make it a limited future. Gas is a transition fuel, and the future has to be green, and these strategic minerals are very important to that.
Okay. And Mr. Sibal, quick concluding comment from you on these two aspects, which Pramit pointed out. One is perhaps digital technology being one of the areas where we can explore further avenues, and also increased involvement of the private sector when we are talking about the strengthening of economic relations.
No, he's absolutely right. In fact, from my time onwards, and even before that, it was a bit different because Russia was sort of moving out of its communist past, and there were oligarchs in between who were looting the country, and there was a lot of suspicion of private sector there. But anyway, the short point is that we tried very hard, and we've been trying very hard to put the private sector of the two countries together. There have been so many business forums formed, CEOs forum formed. Each time there is a big visit, there are huge delegations that come. So I don't think there has been any dearth of contacts at the business level, but it is not fructified into anything serious. The CII is not taking much interest in Russia. In the past, some delegation used to go. In recent years, I don't know if they have gone or not. Tata is involved in, or was involved in a big project in the Russian Far East, but I believe this is running into some sort of trouble. We want to involve the private sector in the coking coal area, imports of coking coal from Russia. I think this is a real problem. There is a lack of information, lack of trust, and what has hit also the interest in Russia is what happened to Systema in the telecom sector. And that's where the digital thing comes in. I think they feel that they burned their fingers in this area, and there would be some reluctance. But beyond that, in terms of innovation, everything else, including in this IT sector, and we tried very hard in the past. We suggested that let us set up a joint fund, which will be devoted to innovation. We'll contribute $100 million. They can do that. And we can work together and share the IPs. Somehow, the Russian IT sector is structured in such a way that it has become difficult to operate. They don't have, let's say, a body like the NESCOM there. So there are some issues, but yes, I agree. In theory, this is true. In terms of rare earths, of course, China is sitting on 80% or more, of 85% or more of the rare earth supply globally. But Russia had great strength in this area, especially in Central Asia, where they used to do mining, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan area. But yes, this is an area which I have not studied this, but should have potential, and we should work on it together if we can.
Okay. Okay, there it is. Thank you so much, Mr. Kanwal Sibal, as well as Professor Harsh Pant and Pramit Paul there for sharing your views with us and our viewers here on India-Russia bilateral relations, the geopolitical factors affecting these relations, as well as the way ahead to strengthen the bond. There are various aspects. Obviously, defense continues to be one of the strongest pillars, but then there are other sectors as well, like energy, digital technologies, as well as more involvement of the private sector from both sides. We'll come back again next week with a different topic. Till then, keep watching Rajya Sabha Television.